Episode 5 of the Philosophical Rambler podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Stephen DeLay, who is a very accomplished philosopher in the area of phenomenology, and I'll let you introduce yourself, Stephen, properly so the viewers can understand a bit of who you are.
Hi, Collin. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here today. I'm an academic philosopher and a writer. I've published some novels and then a number of academic philosophical monographs, mainly in the tradition of what you just mentioned, phenomenology. But if I were to try to summarize my work, I would say that I'm a Christian existentialist is maybe the best way to describe it.
Okay. Starting off with that, I believe today we're going to be talking about basically the future of philosophy, academic philosophy versus kind of what we're seeing online, more pop or non-academic philosophy nowadays. So first question to get us started in our discussion would be, where do you think academic philosophy is going, and does it still have any use today? I know it's kind of a broad question, but it allows you to kind of freestyle a bit.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go. It's difficult to say what the future will hold, though we can make some sort of predictions or guesses that maybe onto something. The first issue is what exactly how we define philosophy. So when I was first introduced to philosophy as an academic discipline in the university, it was still pretty customary to tell students that there's a divide between what is called analytic and continental philosophy. And that's a divide or a distinction that's increasingly come under scrutiny. Fewer and fewer people hold to it as dogmatically as was once the case, for example, in the 20th century. But broadly speaking, this divide, however exactly one understands it, it had sociological consequences in terms of how departments aligned themselves with what they considered to be serious philosophy and what they didn't. And so in the Anglophone world, especially, you find the major philosophical departments that were considered to be the best, places like Princeton and other places such as that would have been engaging in what's called analytic philosophy. And then you had other departments that were more interested in what's called continental philosophy. One of the troubles with the distinction is that if you define continental philosophy as European philosophy, you'll find that actually many of the most influential continental philosophers today are actually American or British. And a number of the people who are considered analytic philosophers were actually European. And so it's difficult to define the division between these two philosophies geographically. Then if you try to draw the distinction substantively in terms of philosophical theses that one camp holds that the other doesn't, there again, it doesn't work. So there's not really, I don't think, that much of the distinction anymore. So if you ask the question, well, what's the future, for example, of analytic philosophy? I think analytic philosophy is in somewhat of a crisis. The heyday of analytic philosophy, beginning maybe with Oxford in the 20th century with ordinary language philosophy, is when it really took institutional hold and then migrated to the States. A lot of the greatest and most influential analytic philosophers have passed away or they've now retired. And there isn't really a generation of analytic philosophers that kind of has the same sort of star power as what you saw back in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. So analytic philosophy doesn't, to me, as far as I can see, really have much of a future. I don't think it's going to be making the kind of contributions to intellectual public life that it was in the latter half of the 20th century. As for continental philosophy, there again, the situation is complicated because you have a number of different philosophical movements and traditions that fall under the umbrella of continental philosophy. And many of those traditions are now defunct. There aren't people who are engaging in work that's meant to continue those traditions, partly because these traditions fell apart through imminent critique. So in the 20th century, you had movements like structuralism and post-structuralism. Those movements really aren't alive in philosophical departments. They've migrated into other departments in the humanities, like in literary theory and anthropology and places like that. The one living philosophical tradition, continental tradition, is the one that I adhere to, which is phenomenology. And phenomenology, for its own part, is still very much alive. And there's a number of really influential and important living philosophers, particularly in France, who are keeping the tradition alive. And then there's a number of people
Mhm.
in the Anglophone world who have sort of taken up that work and are continuing to do new things. So I would say the future of philosophy is, it's difficult to see what the future of analytic philosophy is. It's difficult to see what the future of continental philosophy is outside of phenomenology. I see phenomenology continuing to make progress and probably to draw further interest from people who are realizing that these other traditions are sort of drying up. That's my view or my
Mhm.
assessment of where the academic discipline is at the moment.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a great insight because obviously you have great experience on the academic side of philosophy, and then you've kind of transitioned over time to more of the online side of things. So you have both worlds of experience. As far as the academic world goes, as we've talked about in the past before, not on a podcast, but just in general, is the academic world seems to become further and further aloof from the discussions that are going on that are on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it nowadays. Because what you see on X, which you're quite active on, is up to the minute what's going on politically, socially, culturally, philosophically. Um, it seems to me personally, as someone who is pursuing a bachelor's soon in philosophy in the undergrad world, that the undergrad remains the same, but yet when you look to the masters and when you look to higher education in those fields, that it becomes further and further into the niches of what people are really trying to get out of grants out of their departments, really, if that makes sense. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. So in academic philosophy, right now, there's a turn to what's called public philosophy. So you find a lot of these academic
Sure.
philosophers who will write for print media, typically legacy
Mm-hmm.
outlets, trying to introduce uh, readers who are not familiar with academic philosophy to important philosophical figures that you would study if you were at a
Okay.
university, right? And so this is where
Mm-hmm.
you get like pop stoicism, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
political interest, right? Wading into these political questions, and part of the issue is that on the social media side, like Twitter or whatever, long form engagement isn't really that viable, right? So people prefer photographs,
Mm-hmm.
they prefer little snippets. You can't really have a long form debate in the form of an essay. So it's unclear to me what
Mm-hmm.
kind of genuine or important philosophical work can be done on social media, like in Twitter. Of course, you have
Mm-hmm.
other venues like Substack and things where people will write longer, more creative essays that require a reader to exercise sustained attention and things of that nature. And there you get a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people who aren't coming from an academic background, an academic philosophical background that will give you Nietzsche or some of these other really famous philosophical luminaries. The trouble there is that very often the people who are engaging in that kind of work don't maybe understand the philosophical figure as well as
Mm-hmm.
they think they do. And so I think what's going on is that a lot of academic philosophers don't want to engage in the public sphere because they don't see these media as conducive to the kind of serious intellectual debate that you would find in a traditional academic fora, whether
I
that's
see.
a journal article or a book chapter or a monograph. And then at the same time, people who are cynical about the state of the university and don't really hold academic philosophers in high regard anymore aren't seeking out the work that these academics are doing. So most people who are outside of academia aren't going to go and buy academic monographs. They're not going to read the academic
Mm-hmm.
journal. Part of this is because a lot of the academic work is behind paywalls, and academic monographs tend to be expensive. So these are sort of, in a way, insular, self-contained echo chambers. You have the academics plodding along, carrying out their
Exactly.
work, and then you have the public who's having what they take to be philosophical discussions that maybe are in some ways confused.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was like, well, let's bridge a gap here by having what's called public philosophy. I'm not opposed to the idea of public philosophy in principle. It could have a use, but very often the trouble is that the academics who are wading in this tend to be sort of arrogant and they dumb down their views in a way that I think is really patronizing. And so
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that most people want to read that kind of work. And also, just generally, the kind of public philosophy that gets circulated widely is coming from typically legacy publications that already are working within a paradigm that the public is now questioning. And so a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times the public philosophy that's being done by these academics isn't really addressing the issues that the public is now increasingly becoming interested in. So it's unclear to me whether or not that sort of public philosophy really even is going to command an audience, just because there aren't, I don't think, readers interested in engaging with the kinds of analyses that typically academic philosophers are offering in their public philosophy.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting the point you bring up about how academics see the university as kind of their place. They see it as their niche of where they are meant to be almost. That they're viewing the online sphere of people who don't necessarily have their PhD in a field or don't necessarily have any formal credentials, but have, say, 20,000 followers on Twitter. Those people have a much larger influence, I would say, than the academics. But it seems the academics are more, for lack of a better word, stubborn, of wanting to keep their niche, so to speak, I think.
Yeah, that's certainly a dynamic I've seen as well. So a lot of the academics that I would know, colleagues of mine that I've either gone to graduate school with or I just know through publications and conferences, I think they do feel
Mm-hmm.
threatened. It's interesting, right? So in most in the academic circles that I frequent, there's a lot of people who are now very dismissive of what they term populism, even though these are the same
Mm.
people who are constantly extolling the virtues of what they call democracy. So there's a manifest
Oh,
contradiction there. So
yes.
it's interesting, like where they when they're on their on a political tirade, they'll pay lip service to what they call democracy, and at the same time they have such clear contempt for what they see as the masses or the public. And I think part of this
Yeah.
has to do with an identity crisis in the university system itself, is that as the university loses the respect that it once commanded in the eyes of the public, the people who are still operating in an academic environment are feeling threatened, and so they're becoming
Mm-hmm.
hostile to the public, and so they're falling back on credentialism, and they're also falling back on the reputation that these universities once justifiably deserved. And the trouble is that a
Mm-hmm.
lot of institutions, they aren't what they once were. So it'll
Yeah.
be interesting to
Quite
see
obvious.
what the future of the university is and how it's going to relate to the public. Of course, I mean, the origin of the university was that in a way was supposed to be set apart from town, right? From the
It's true.
city, from the public. It was supposed to be a place of scholarship and intellectual pursuit. The trouble is that, of
Mm-hmm.
course, as people are now well aware, in some ways the university has abandoned that mission, and rather than being focused on producing research, it's sort of become an extended organ of powers that are not, strictly speaking, scholarly, right? So there's corporate influence, there's
Yeah.
government influence, there's state influence. So that's the trouble I think that a lot of academics are having, academic philosophers are having, is that they want their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to claim that
Mm-hmm.
the research university is a place of research and serious scholarship. Yet at the same time, I think they're kind of resentful that they have less influence in shaping public opinion as they once did. But then when they're forced to
Mm-hmm.
accept that one of the reasons why they no longer have the influence over public opinion they once did is that the public no longer takes seriously their claim that they're just engaging in pure research and not propaganda or ideology, they don't engage with that. And they don't actually try to wrestle with the public's misgivings about what the current condition of the university is.
Yeah. I think that's a very valid point in the fact that the word that comes to mind, or the term that comes to mind, would be intellectual elitism, almost of people setting themselves apart in their world of their intellectual circles, which is something that anyone can fall into, whether they're on the academic or non-academic side. Is they can fall into their echo chamber of whoever they're following on social media, whoever they're watching on YouTube or listening to, or even if they're at a university and they're not necessarily falling into what I call the academic category of someone who's pursuing that life in academia, or trying to become a professor or a scholar or something along those lines, they can still have that same echo chamber of their little niche intellectual friend group, so to speak. And they can think that they're having a great impact if they have 5 people in the room who all agree with them, you know. But at the end of the day, you have people such as Jordan Peterson, I would say, who comes from the academic background, you know, and then is now pop philosophy in its purest form, in my opinion, besides the likes of, say, Ryan Holiday, for example, with the Daily Stoic and such. But I think what we see is academic philosophy, like I said, becoming more aloof almost, because I can't name a time when, looking back at history, your average layman, so to speak, would go and read a philosophy journal, because likely he wasn't interested in philosophy because, well, I mean, it wasn't really his wheelhouse, really. I mean, what he now sees on Twitter, or what he listens to Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan or any of these guys who are talking about more intellectual ideas than your Sunday sports, they feel like they're having valuable discussions. And I think that probably is a good thing, though, that the public is moving more towards that direction. What do you think?
I agree. I'm not the first to note this, but there's a long history of important thinkers who, not just in intellectual history, but in shaping public discussion at the time in which were writing, or subsequently after their deaths, who were not
Mm-hmm.
academic, did not have university positions, and typically the people relatively recent examples of this hail from the existentialist tradition, right? So, in the 19th
Definitely.
century, you have someone like Nietzsche, who, of course, for a time was a professor until resigning his professorship. You have someone like Kierkegaard, who never landed an academic position at all. And then in the 20th
Mm-hmm.
century, again, you have other people like Camus, who wasn't a professor, Sartre. So Heidegger was for a time, but I mean, a lot of the great thinkers were very ambivalent about their position as university professors, and whether or not actually genuine philosophy is compatible with the university setting at all, or whether or not the very notion of a university and the division of intellectual labor among the faculties, and what
Mm-hmm.
kind of work, intellectual labor, if you will, is rewarded in the university, is actually consistent with what a philosophical life even should be. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I mean, do you have to go to a university and be an academic to engage in philosophy? I think the answer is no. Can you be a philosopher while being an academic and a university professor? That's maybe the better question, right? Because for a long time,
That's a very good question.
there's a lot of philosophers who have wondered, does that kind of life actually involve a kind of intellectual or moral or spiritual compromise of your integrity that's inconsistent with being a philosopher? And of course,
Mm-hmm.
that's a distinction that goes all the way back to the ancient times with Plato and Socrates, and this question of the distinction between the sophists and philosophers, those who are paid to do philosophy, or what they purport to be philosophy, and those who do it
Mm-hmm.
for reasons other than a title or a job or social influence.
Yeah. I think that gets to the root also, though, of the reason for people doing philosophy. Or, by what I mean by doing philosophy, is philosophizing in the first place, thinking about ideas. I mean, after all, it's the love of wisdom. We're trying to make people more wise, to have more knowledge about the world, about themselves. And I think if you look at the academics, I could say quite bluntly, in my opinion, of course, it's just my opinion, but I would say they failed to do that in recent times. They failed to educate people about themselves and about the world without having ideology come into the fray. Whereas if you look to the likes of people on Twitter, or people who are writing on Substack, Medium, whatever you have, it is much more focused on those individuals and their life experiences. I feel like people can relate to that more, maybe. Um, when someone writes about, maybe the deeper meaning of the 9 to 5 in like a philosophical context, where they're talking about it from maybe an existentialist viewpoint, I think that maybe has more meaning and more substance to the average guy who's interested in philosophy than perhaps what the academics realize. And when you talk about the academics being interested in having that influence back, I think that influence comes largely from the credential of, I'm professor at Oxford, I'm professor at Austin, UT Austin, or wherever it may be. That used to have a great authority, as you know. It used to be, if you were in even let's say the early 2000s, and you said you're the professor of philosophy at Oxford or the professor of philosophy at Cambridge. I mean, that's a title, that's something important. But now I would say you have just as much influence, some guy in Nebraska just writing off his computer, for example, than if you have like the 10,000 followers, like I said, then perhaps that professor.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of what constitutes influence, or there's different kinds of influence, right? So, I mean, in 100 years from now, I think it's very likely that nobody will be reading any of these Substack articles that are
That's
trending on
true.
Twitter for 2 days, right? Whereas,
Yeah.
some of these academic books may actually be incredibly influential. Maybe many people will be reading them. It's hard to say. I think for me, as a philosopher, I don't write for influence. Of course, I would like my
Mm-hmm.
work to be influential if that is possible, but I'm not writing with the intention of trying to be influential, just trying to write the best
Mm-hmm.
philosophy that I can, and then take solace in the fact that those who do read it hopefully will enjoy it and take something good from it. And I think that, there's whether you look at existentialism or you look at someone like Descartes, or back into the ancients, the classical conception of philosophy as a way of life, there's a longstanding tradition that has seen philosophy as a pursuit or as a discipline that's really about oneself and focusing on
Mm-hmm.
oneself. Not in an egoistic or self-centered way, but in the sense
Yeah,
of human excellence, about becoming the best kind of human being that you can become. And
exactly.
there the idea is that in you striving to be the best that you can be, you may wield influence through your example, that others see what you're doing. And it's less about
Mm-hmm.
trying to write something that becomes influential right at the moment, right? And I think part of the issue that some philosophers have in an academic sense is that because the literature, the secondary literature, as they call it, has become so technical and dry, they have a meaning crisis
Mm-hmm.
in their own lives, because what may have drawn them to philosophy when they were young, they realize that they're no longer engaging in the kind of questions and the kind of work that originally interested them. And so then maybe
Mm-hmm.
their way of sort of compensating for the fact that their work isn't really genuinely philosophical in the way in which that they hope that it may be when they first started in the discipline, they then go looking for clout through writing what they call popular philosophy, and that doesn't work because
Yeah.
it doesn't ring true, right? If you have a professor at a
Mm-hmm.
university who's engaging in sort of very boring, tedious work in like the philosophy of language or metaphysics, and then all of a sudden they try to moonlight as Socrates in the New Yorker, people can see that there's something very artificial about that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that speaks to what you're talking about is the technical language. I think that's what I'm getting at as well.
Mm.
Of the lack of meaning comes down to the technical language. Because as someone who considers myself to be very interested in philosophy, obviously, I mean, I run this publication and this channel. It is increasingly futile for me to try to read what those academic philosophers put out. And that is someone who is interested in trying to aspire to understand what they are putting out. It would require so much prerequisite reading on that area that you'd have to read for, not trying to over exaggerate here, but you'd have to read for like a month to understand what exactly that specific article is talking about within the proper context and tradition, and even what that person has written previously. Obviously, that's the case as well for anyone, that you need to understand what the context and what the language being used is. But like I said, the aloofness of it, the technical words that are being used, are so far removed from, as you stated a minute ago, the actual act of philosophizing, that maybe it is leaving them without a sense of meaning in the everyday understanding of philosophy, where people are trying to think about the meaning of life, for example. And maybe that's why these people, not even the academics, but I would say the non academic philosophers, have risen to so much popularity?
I think that sometimes philosophy being obscure can be bad. On the other hand, I sometimes think it's
Mhm.
necessary. So when it comes to the terminology that, or the technical vocabulary that a particular kind of philosophy is using, um, it may actually serve a purpose, and I would actually think that it's valuable. So part of this has to do with the fact that, for example, in the case of phenomenology, this is an ongoing conversation that spans like well over, at the very minimum, over 100 years. So it's true that someone
Mhm.
could pick up Heidegger's Being and Time, for example, or a more recent work by one of these French figures like Jean-Luc Marion or someone, and be completely mystified by whatever it is these texts are saying, and then be led to say, well, this is a waste of time.
Mhm.
Why doesn't Heidegger just express himself more clearly? Why doesn't Marion express himself more clearly? Well,
Yeah, no, it's possible.
I think that these works are clear once you know the language. And so long as the
Mhm.
language is actually saying something essential and meaningful, then it serves a point. I mean, this is what Heidegger says somewhere in that even Being in Time, is that he's trying to develop the language to describe things we don't ordinarily notice. The
Mhm.
trouble with the technical language is that if it's not actually illuminating something worthwhile or showing us something worthwhile, then it's just vapid, right? So I don't think necessarily the
Yeah.
issue is the technical terminology per se. I think what it is it's technical terminology that's mobilized in the pursuit of what's ultimately a pretty paltry question, right? That I think is the problem.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because the end which they're trying to achieve within the technical language has little interest typically to the outside world. Specifically, I mean, even in phenomenology, I mean, obviously you're quite well versed in the field. But even then, I mean, if you went up to someone on the street and asked them what phenomenology was, I mean, they probably couldn't answer you
they wouldn't know.
unless they had. Yeah, exactly. They wouldn't know. So I'm saying
Well, this is
at the
a
end of the day, it depends who you want to influence, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a question I've been thinking about recently with a volume that I edited on nihilism, the problem of nihilism, and so there's this question of
Yes.
the relationship between history and the history of ideas, or another way to put it is, what's the relationship between philosophical systems, philosophical ideas, and the milieu in which they come into existence, and then the future. So is it that philosophical systems and philosophical doctrines are shaping the broader culture, or is it that the culture shapes these systems, right?
Mhm.
And people debate this, right? So like on a classic sort of
Of course.
Marxian view, there's a thesis which I guess you could call like sociological determinism, which is that philosophical systems are ideological expressions of the society in
Mhm.
which they arise. And so, on that view of things, the history of ideas is almost sort of like epiphenomenal, right? It's like history is on this course that it is for reasons and causes that have nothing to do with the actual history of ideas. The history of ideas is, as it were, sort of just smoke that's billowing up, that's just sort of accompanying the train engine as it chugs along, right? On the other hand, you could
Mhm.
go in a more idealist direction and say that actually philosophical systems do, in some sense, shape society. And it could be that these ideas and these systems are shaping society in very profound and important ways, even if the people who are living in those societies can't recognize that influence and don't know it, right? So I would
Mhm.
say, for example, that, and this is why I think nihilism is an interesting philosophical topic, is that nihilism is a word everybody knows, right? It comes up in everyday
Yeah.
language. It's a topic that everyone's discussing, this crisis of meaning. And that's a long-standing philosophical topic that goes all the way back to, like, at least the 18th century, when the term was originally coined by a very obscure German philosopher who nobody reads anymore. So there's an example where so much of public discussion and society and our cultural understanding seems to be shaped by what was originally a very sort of provincial, insular philosophical discussion among German philosophers at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, and yet it's been very influential in how everybody today thinks. And it's the same thing with the existentialists, right? So it could be that a lot of people today have never read any Camus, they've never read any Sartre, they've never read any Nietzsche, but in some sense,
Mhm.
the world around them is very Nietzschean, is very Sartrean in ways that they may not be able to
Yeah.
conceptually identify and name, but nonetheless, this is part of the inheritance of the tradition that they're living in. So, yeah, I guess all
I
this is
mean,
to say is that philosophers may actually wield a kind of influence, even if the influence goes unrecognized by those who are under it, right?
yeah, it kind of reminds me of where artists talk about, I'm not going to be appreciated in my lifetime, but I'll be appreciated after I die. There's that whole trope of what people talk about. Um, but I think that plays into the fact that philosophy goes beyond our life. It's almost like history. Philosophers play into the larger narrative or the larger tradition, the larger story, really, of philosophy and their particular tradition, of course, of what they write about, what they talk about, and what they want to research. But I think that it's almost two different ways of viewing philosophy from the academic to the non-academic side. Well, of course, there are two different ways of viewing it, but I guess in the intention of what they're trying to do is, as you mentioned a little bit ago, the non-academic philosophers are writing more for the week, perhaps, if they're lucky. They're writing for the week of the headline of what is going to trend on social media, what's going to impact people now. And that may work for people who are alive currently, but obviously the internet hasn't been around for tremendously long. So we haven't seen the long-term impacts of someone reading an article from 40 years into the future, if someone's going to be watching this video or reading anything on the Philosophical Rambler website. Obviously I would hope they do, but we simply don't have the track record for that. So I think there is a benefit then to the academic philosophy in the way that there's an established record, like you said, of, maybe this isn't going to influence the public per se now, but maybe one day someone's going to cite this in an article and that's going to go into a book and people are going to say, okay, now I understand why this person said this at this time. And then, well, I mean, it becomes worth it then from the standpoint of the philosophical tradition as a whole, but maybe not from the standpoint of the individual's ego of them wanting to become known for their ideas. So there's almost kind of a martyrdom, a little mini martyrdom in that of, sacrificing yourself for the greater good of philosophy in the academic sense. But to continue on more towards the second half of what we were going to talk about was the state of the university system and perhaps the decline of the university system and also maybe where we see it going in the future, both you and I. And I guess to phrase that question is, do you think that people have overstated the decline of universities?
Yes and no. So I think
It's not a philosophical answer.
yeah, well, I mean, this goes to the heart of what I think something we're sort of been on the margins of this entire discussion, which is this techno Babel, right? So
Mm.
everybody has a voice, everybody has a say, but it's unclear what there's no place of one address anymore, right? So, like in
Mm-hmm.
1965, there were like three television channels. You had like ABC, NBC, and whatever, and everybody
Yep.
got together as a family after dinner, and they watched the news. And so there was a
Mm-hmm.
place of one address. Clearly, that's no longer the case whatsoever. So when you ask, is the decline of the university overstated? I think, some people they don't even think that the university is in a decline, right? So, for example, I saw
Mm-hmm.
an article that came out just yesterday about how evidently the annual cost of sending one's kid to Vanderbilt next year will be $100,000. So you have to
Yeah.
think that the families that are sending their kids to Vanderbilt, and I actually know some incredibly wealthy families back from my time in Houston who did this with their kids. They went to Vanderbilt. Uh, they think it's worthwhile for their kid to be there. So if you're going to be
Mm-hmm.
spending $100,000 for your kid to be at Vanderbilt, you must think that there's a reason to be at Vanderbilt. That
There's a value.
A Vanderbilt degree still matters, that there's some future that you're opening for your child that Vanderbilt
Mm-hmm.
will provide. But clearly, like that, a lot of people have seen that that's just no longer something you should take for granted. In fact, there are other people who are now saying, if you really love your kids, don't let them go to university at all, right? Um,
Yeah.
And we
Two
even
sides of the
right,
discussion.
and we even so right there's it's very it's bizarre, right? So you have people who are saying, "Oh, my kid got into
Hmm.
Vanderbilt, and like this is a big accomplishment." And at the same time, you have people who are alumni at Harvard who say, "I'm not going to donate to Harvard anymore. I would never let my kid go to
Hmm.
Harvard." Right? So
But yeah, it's bizarre, as you
I
say.
think I think some people have no idea yet that the
Hmm.
university is undergoing the decline that it is. At the same time, I think there are people who recognize the decline who are maybe overly pessimistic, and they think that the university is now at this point fundamentally unreformable and it's irrevocably broken, and we now just need to start thinking solely about creating our own institutions. I don't know if
Hmm.
that's the case either. My view is that things will continue to get worse for the foreseeable future. And then the question
Hmm.
becomes whether or not these regimes break under their own incompetence and corruption, and then they can be reclaimed and restored to what they once were, or whether or not the destruction of these universities and their reputations is so thoroughgoing that by the time that collapse finally happens and it's recognized by everybody, there are new institutions that have arisen which will just have in effect supplanted those old ones. I just don't know.
Yeah. What I think is interesting is a lot of people nowadays think that new institutions have to be built. And they say, well, we need a college for people who believe this way or a college for people who believe this way. Wherever people are on the spectrum of politics and religion and such, they'd say we need a college for everyone. But the point is, college/university is not supposed to be tailored to exactly your needs, in my opinion, is what I think. Is, you're supposed to go there to engage with ideas. You're not supposed to be in an echo chamber, as we talked about earlier. You're supposed to engage with, really, what I've been thinking about recently is the spirit of the age. The idea of the prevailing ideas of what's going on today. And I feel like a lot of people, perhaps on the right wing side of politics, often view the universities, because they're more on the liberal side of politics, generally speaking. They view them as irreconcilable in the fact that they are unable to perhaps retake those institutions in their own politics, mold them in their own way. So instead, they say, well, let's just abandon these altogether because, well, they're not saying perhaps my politics. Um, and people say, well, I'm not going to send my kid to that anymore, because I don't want him or her believing that. But also, I mean, the universities have always been more, for lack of a better statement, free thinking. I mean, they've always had more of a left wing bent since their founding, in the fact of the American sense, at least. So I think that perhaps it's just a time period where people will say, like the 60s, where things were particularly just more to the left than they usually are. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a number of things to say. I don't know whether or not you'll find any of it interesting, but I'll just spout off and see what you think. So, I mean, one thing is I'm turning 38 next month, so I'm
Mhm.
old, but I'm also young, right? It's all relative, right? So to
Yeah.
people who are in high school or college, I'm an old guy, but there's plenty of people who look at me as young because they're like in their 60s. So it's an interesting age to be
Hmm.
during this particular period of time because high school and college for me isn't such a distant memory. And yet at the same time,
Hmm.
so much has changed in the short while since I was a student that now people who are going through high school and college who talk to me, I can tell them about what's almost like a foreign country or a forgotten past about what university life used to be like, even just say 15 years ago, right? So one of the things that
Yeah.
I think one problem here with the university is that too many people have gone to university, and I'm not the only person to say this. I'm not the first person to say it, and that
I
people
agree.
people disagree about what the causes behind too many people having gone to college is and what we should do about it. But I do think that too many people have gone to university, and so like in
Hmm.
my case, growing up in California in the Bay Area, in a very sort of like progressive upper middle class bourgeois background, the expectation was that everybody's going to go to college, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
this is, you're talking late 90s, early aughts. Uh, for one of my friends to not go to college would have been a scandal. It would have been an embarrassment for the family, right? So,
Yeah.
okay, well, how many of my friends should have actually gone to college? Not most of them should not have, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they weren't actually interested in living a scholarly life, and they weren't going to be going to one of the professions that typically a university education was necessary for, like, for example, law or medicine. So what happened is that
Mm-hmm.
basically there was this social inertia where more and more people were expected by their parents to go to university just because that's what one did, even if there was no real clear reason for scholarly or vocational reasons for why they should be going. And this is where we get the debt
Mm-hmm.
crisis, and so when with the economic problems where people got saddled with debt, and there was no future for them that they thought that they were going to see
Mm-hmm.
on the other side of the university. So I just think probably one thing that has to happen is that fewer people should be going to university, because it's not really necessary for most people anyway. Um, and part of this too is that if you really love ideas and you love reading, you can be Goodwill Hunting and you can just read on your own. You don't have to go to a university to do that unless for some reason you want a credential or some kind of degree that will enable you to go into academia. But if you don't want to be an academic, then why really go to a university and drop $100,000 at Vanderbilt to do philosophy? I don't see the reason. So anyway, one thing is too many people went to university. That's a problem. And
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, this to me, it's a question of vocation. So I mean, this is like why I said I do Christian existentialism. I view these things from
Mm-hmm.
a Christian point of view. Like if I were an atheist, like like Jean-Paul Sartre, I would tell you, well, there's no right answer other than what you decide to do. You're going to die, so make the most of your life, and you're ultimately
Yeah.
responsible for it. I very much agree with that. I'm very much an existentialist. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
there are right answers for each person, given who he is and what his life plan could or should be from God's perspective about do you go to university or not. I think there is an answer, but it's a very personal one. So it's difficult for me to give sort of
Mm-hmm.
wide sweeping, generalized, universal dictums about what people ought or ought not to do. I think, particularly at this point in time, it's clear that it's going to come down to a matter of personal discretion. And people have to be very honest with themselves and sensitive to their own situation to make that decision for themselves. It's not like, 2002, where everybody graduates high school and you just go to college. That kind of thinking, I don't think, is viable anymore. So I wouldn't want to say nobody should go to university, but I also don't want to say that, well, yeah, of course you should just go and hope for the best. I think people have to be a little bit more introspective about this and really try to figure out for themselves, well, what kind of person am I trying to become? And why is going to a university important or not for that reason? And that's just a
Mm-hmm.
very personal decision.
Yeah, I mean, when you look back in history at what the university was, like you said, it was very set apart. It was something for originally, I mean, more of the nobility, the aristocrats, in a sense of, we're going to go and we're going to talk about these ideas because, well, we can. We don't have to work in the fields, we don't have to do the manual labor that's required to sustain life.
Well,
And so,
I mentioned law and I
yeah,
mentioned medicine, but of course the other thing was the clergy, the seminary. So all of our great East
it's
Coast
true.
universities were divinity schools, and that's no longer the case. Like in Oxford, for
Hmm.
example, for a very long period of time, in order to be a don at the Faculty of Theology in Cambridge as well, I believe you had to take an oath swearing that you believed in the divine inspiration of the Holy Scriptures.
Hmm.
So these are very different institutions, right? Like if Oxford or
Yeah.
Cambridge try to force somebody to do that, I mean, that would be an international scandal, and all the redditors would be up in arms about, like, how that's like illegal. You can't do that. But for hundreds of years, that's
Yeah. Yeah.
okay,
That's immoral.
right? I mean, the
Yeah.
Oxford's motto is taken directly from a psalm. I mean, so many of our universities are, right. So
Yeah.
get it.
Most university mottos are scripture related.
Yeah. So look, I mean, it's you think about like Emerson's favorite famous lecture at Harvard to the divinity school. Like that
Hmm.
was considered scandalous, even though for a time Emerson still purported to be a Christian and to believe in God and these sorts of things. But this was such a scandalous lecture at the time because he was speaking to guys that were trained in the divinity school that were going to be clergy. And that's just not the Harvard that
Hmm.
we have today. So, I mean, if you were a Bostonian in 1850, the question about whether or not to go to Harvard was a pretty simple one. Do you want to be a lawyer? Do you want to be a doctor?
Yeah.
Do you want to be a clergyman? And there would have been, do you want to be a classicist?
Hmm.
It was a simple question. Today, the question I think is much more complicated about like, why go to Harvard? What are you actually trying to accomplish? So,
Yeah. I think people have many different reasons for why they would choose to go to Harvard, whether it be networking, whether it be study, whether it be prestige, status, the credential, or further opening doors for themselves in academia. There's countless different reasons. To the note of Vanderbilt and the $100,000 a year, I would say obviously one, university has become wildly overinflated for its purposes, which I'd say most people would agree on. I don't know about you. Would you agree with that?
oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I'd say it has made itself so lofty that, and people have indebted themselves so much to it that they feel the need to perpetuate the system, if that makes sense, because it's part of them. It's like a chunk has been taken out of them and they need that chunk back, but they have to validate that the chunk has been taken out of them,
Can I tell you?
monetarily, but also part of their life.
Can I tell you a story, a kind of anecdote that I think
Sure.
illustrates what you're getting at? So, okay, so one thing is like growing up, my parents always had like certain little lessons they would always try to teach me. And I realized now that I was like getting like existentialism for kids, even though they didn't really think about it that way. Because like I was growing up in the Bay Area, and this was like during like the tech boom, and my mother worked in Silicon
Hmm.
Valley, and my dad had worked in the defense industry, like in a corporate environment at Lockheed Martin. So I'd hear all these work stories from both of them growing up about the people they had to work with and the workplace politics and all this stuff. And so it was kind of like a study in human nature for me to hear from my parents their impressions of what other people were like and what was motivating others to behave
Hmm.
the way they did, and the kind of social psychology about how these kinds of places worked. And one of the things that my parents both always said, sort of for different reasons, but they came to the same conclusion. They always try to tell me, is like, Stephen, other people, they don't really care about you. Like they're focused on themselves. And they weren't saying that
Hmm.
this is how things ought to be or that I should be that way myself. They weren't saying, well, be selfish, ignore others, just get what you want. They were trying to, I think, explain to me why I should feel free in life and not feel pressured to be a conformist, right? Is that
Hmm.
people get so preoccupied with what they think others think about them that they fail to realize that everybody is just as equally concerned about what they think others are thinking about them, right?
Yeah.
And so this gets to the heart of this whole like prestige question or chasing a reputation. It's like, okay, well, you could make the decision to go to Vanderbilt or Harvard or as a student, or your parents want you to because you think it matters, but nobody else really cares, right? Like, I went to
Hmm.
Oxford. When I go around town, I don't get a discount at the coffee shop.
Yeah.
I don't
That's
walk in.
true.
I don't walk in with my cape, right? I mean, no one cares, right? Nobody cares. Nobody
Yeah.
asks me. And so again, I think this is also why we're seeing like an increase in mental illness and disaffection, is that a lot of people are starting to realize like they made choices thinking that there were going to be sort of benefits for them that they no longer get. So, you go to Harvard, you
Hmm.
pay all this money, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're living in Brooklyn, like spending $3,000 for a room while you work as a barista. You're going to be angry about that. So I guess what I'm trying to say here
Yeah.
is that you know clout chasing, looking for a reputation, thinking that going and being part of one of these institutions will matter. There's a lot of flawed thinking involved, and I think in that calculus. First problem is that these institutions are increasingly losing the reputation they used to have. Second of all, is that even if
Hmm.
they still enjoyed the reputation they once did, no one else really on a day-to-day basis cares that that's what you did, right? They're just interested in impressing
Hmm.
others for what they've done. Um, and like the anecdote I wanted to tell you is a little while ago, I went back to California to see my parents, and I was in the airport there at San Luis Obispo, which is a small little airport. and there were these two mothers that were probably like, I don't know, in their late 40s and early 50s, and they were on a college visiting tour with their kids, high school kids. They were visiting all these different universities to see which one they liked best. And they had just visited
Mm-hmm.
Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, and they
Mm-hmm.
evidently loved the school, and then they were talking about how their kids were thinking that might be the place that their kids want to attend. And of course, I went to Cal Poly, and my parents live in San
Mm-hmm.
Luis Obispo, so that place in California and that university was a big part of my life for many years, and in some ways still is. And it was funny to me as like this middle-aged guy sitting there in an airport in California, what used to be his hometown, getting ready to fly across the country to Winston-Salem. They have no idea who I am. They have no idea that I went to Oxford. They have no idea that I've published all these books, some of which, if their kid ever took a philosophy class, they might be assigned to read. And so
Yeah,
I had this like really intense urge to just tell them like, hey, just so you know, like,
this is who I am.
I mean, but I could see them be like, well, who cares? But that's the myopia of life, right? It's like, well, Johnny's got to go to Cal Poly, but it's like, well, ma'am, who cares? Like, Johnny could go to Cal Poly, study philosophy, go off to Oxford,
Mm-hmm.
write a bunch of books, and he'll just be me sitting next to you, and you don't care who I am. So what are you worried about Johnny? Eh, And so
Yeah.
there's this kind of social illusion that like going and getting these degrees and seeking out these sorts of accolades is somehow valuable or important, and I just don't think that it is. So again, I wouldn't say that
Mm-hmm.
no one should go to university, but I think that if you do go to university, you have to have a very good reason. And I think if you don't go to university for that reason, then it's not going to turn out well for you. You're going to end up disappointed for the reasons that so many millennials have now sort of lived through for themselves.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And the fact that obviously I am choosing to go to university and to go to a more higher, prestigious one at that. But the reason for me doing so is for vocation, for what I want to do career wise, which I'm quite interested in the field of law. And obviously, to go into the legal field in the United States, you must have both a bachelor's and then you must go to law school. And to do that, I mean, one of the best degrees for that is philosophy. And so people can go and they can get a philosophy degree. If someone just said, I'm just going to go to school, I'm just going to get a philosophy degree, I don't know what I'm going to do after that. I say, well, that's a dumb choice because you're going to have all this debt. You have no clue what you're going to do. And if you're just going to state school, I mean, that's not really going to open any doors for you. If you're going to Harvard or Oxford or such like that, I mean, maybe that may open more doors for you. Maybe you may meet someone there and something happens and you get a job offer, for example, something along those lines. But it's not guaranteed. You're not going to pay all this money and all of a sudden, boom, you're going to get a job offer and you're going to meet some billionaire's son or something. You're not going to meet Mark Zuckerberg all of a sudden. But I think that boils down, like you said, to the point of really why is someone going? And perhaps what we're seeing maybe is not so much a decline of the university in the sense of its original purpose, but maybe a decline in the sense of all these people going. We're seeing maybe a decline in we don't need, I believe it's 40 to 50,000 people who are currently at Indiana University in Bloomington, hour and a half south of me right now. I mean, perhaps we don't need all those people doing that. We don't need hundreds of people in business classes getting business degrees, just to go into some corporate structure. And I
Yeah.
think many people would agree with that as well.
Well, can I just
But
focus for a minute on this
yeah,
notion
go ahead.
of vocation, because it's such a rich term, right? So on the one hand, it means like a job, but it can also mean a career or a calling. And also, of course, there's a clear religious
True.
resonance to the term, right? So a lot of Christians and theologians throughout the centuries have talked about your vocation being your calling from God, which for so much of Western civilization has entailed a choice of career, a vocation, right?
Yes.
So I'm a big believer of vocation in just the religious, spiritual, Christian sense of a call from God, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what Christian existentialism. So I think really the answer for people's problem about what to do is they have to find the path that God is giving them, that they're to follow. And that's
I
something that
agree.
no, that's something that no one else can tell you. And it could involve you doing things that
Mm-hmm.
seem to be irrational or stupid. So maybe for some people, their calling is to go to university and they have to go into debt. So I wouldn't want to say, well, don't go into
Mm-hmm.
university if you're going to take on debt, because maybe you're called
Exactly.
to do that. Right. So it's difficult. There's
Yeah.
rules of thumbs. You can say generally here are wise and unwise things to do, but that's in a way a kind of worldly way of looking at the human condition that ultimately I think is kind of what gets people into trouble. I think that the task here is,
Mm-hmm.
become who God wants you to become. And that's what you have to do. And that's a vocation, that's a calling. And the trouble with living that life is that there are going to be downsides, that you're going to face challenges in your life that you wouldn't if you're not faithful to your vocation. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
you're going to make decisions to remain faithful to that calling that are not communicable to others. Right? This is the point, I think, one of the key points anyway, to what Kierkegaard is saying in a work like Fear and Trembling, when he talks about Abraham
Mm-hmm.
being a knight of faith, is, well, Abraham can't communicate to others what it is he's doing. And this is what it means to be obedient to God, is
That's yeah.
sometimes obedience to God just means doing something that you know is the right thing to do, even if others don't understand and you can't explain it to them. So that's just the nature of human life. I think it's what makes life mysterious and ultimately such a rewarding gift and exciting. And that's the freedom, the exhilaration of being able to figure out for yourself what it is that you're here to do. And I think the freedom comes in life from realizing that rather than worrying about what others are thinking or trying to fit in, just go and do what you want, what God wants you to do. That's really the only way to do things.
Yeah, I've to kind of wrap up here, I've heard that from many different people I've spoken to in the past, primarily from the academic standpoint rather than the non-academic standpoint of, they said I didn't really care about, say, how much debt I was taking on or what I was doing. Obviously, I mean, they do care about the debt, but I'm saying they chose that path of what they were going to do in life. It's like people who become a doctor, for example, in America, you're going to look at 500,000 plus dollars of debt. I mean, if you're going to go to most medical schools, if you're going to do all the years and go through all that, $500,000 is no paltry sum of money. But people go through that and endure that, and they go through the residencies and all of those different trials to be able to become that vocation, to become a doctor. And not necessarily to help people, not necessarily to make money, whatever reason they have for doing it, whether it's law or whether it's medical or scholar, or even, like I said, like in the, like something within the church, then that is what they are to do. Like you said, if university is the path, then that is the path for them to go. But to kind of conclude my point, and then I'll let you wrap up with a finishing statement here, is we are perhaps seeing we're seeing less people have the need for a corporate credential, less people having to go to, say, a state university, or needing to go to a state university, or even wanting to go to get, say, a degree in business, and then having to go to work at some place downtown or whatever major city is near them, which would drastically reduce the whole number of people at the university. Because if it wasn't required to, say, have your bachelor's in business or your bachelor's in finance or economics or whatever to go work at some major international company downtown, whatever city's closest to you, like I said, for me it'd be Indianapolis. People, anecdotally, people go to IU, Indiana University, and then they go and they work downtown Indianapolis, and that's what they think is their pipeline, their path. But that's becoming less and less common, that someone's just going to go to university, get some business degree, and do that. And I think the whole idea of university for business is kind of antithetical in the standpoint of the university is almost based on the humanities. Originally, the university is the humanities and, like you said, seminary. And I'm not saying there's not a place for business within university, but you'll often hear people say, well, has the professor made $1 billion business? Your professor isn't necessarily the most experienced one in that subject. But in philosophy and the humanities, I mean, they know their subject extremely well. That's their area of expertise, and they can actually teach you what they know in that subject. So I think that is where the real teaching goes on. And to summarize all of that, and my whole statement on it is, perhaps it's a good thing that we're seeing this quote unquote decline, so that maybe we can return to what the university is supposed to be.
I agree. What I would say is that because these institutions, whether we consider the university or legacy media, so many of our institutions are justifiably undergoing a credibility crisis and are losing their allure
Mm-hmm.
and have damaged their reputation. There's a reason why people talk about Clown World. I get it. Um, this is good in a way for younger people, especially that it's easier, I think, than ever before to not succumb to the lure of conformism, to feel more comfortable being
True.
honest with yourself about what your calling truly is, rather than following some path that may have been considered socially expedient or acceptable. Less pressure than ever before to do that. So I think there's an immense spiritual freedom for people today that wasn't even available 20 or 30, 40 years ago, when these institutions commanded the kind of respect that they once did. So that's, I think, a blessing in disguise.
Definitely. I think that's a good place to wrap up there, Stephen. And just really glad that you were able to come today and that we were able to have this discussion. And hopefully it blesses the ears of some people, that we're able to bring some inspiration and some value to the discussion, whether it be online or in academia.
Yeah.
So glad to have you.
Well, thanks again, man. It was my pleasure.
Definitely. Hopefully we'll have a discussion in the future where things are a bit more positive for the university system, and hopefully we're see a rise in traditionalism in the humanities, as we all hope will come back in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
So just to all of those who are listening on Spotify or watching on YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe or like the video if you want to support us, or leave a comment. We'd love to reply to any questions or have a discussion in the comment section relating to the podcast or the video. And like I said, if you're listening on Spotify, make sure to give us a follow. And if you so will it, then give us a rating, as we really appreciate it. It helps us to reach more people with our content. So thank you, and I will see you soon.